Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today by asking you to just visualize history for a second. When you think about the past, what do you actually see?
For most people, it's a timeline, right?
Right, a straight line.
Yeah.
1776 on the left, today on the right. And on that line, you've got these
The
bumps,
big moments.
the big moments, the French Revolution, the World Wars, signing treaties, empires falling. We see history as just a collection of events, big, loud things that happened.
It's the greatest hits approach to humanity, really. One thing
Yeah.
happens, it's over, we write it down, and then the next big thing comes along.
But today, we're going to flip that entirely on its head. We're going to suggest that maybe the real building blocks of history aren't the events at all. What if the real story is hidden in the invisible boxes we put people into?
And that's the core question we are tackling. We're looking at a seismic shift in modern historiography. The whole field is moving away from studying what happened as an event, and it's moving towards studying categories.
Categories like criminal, student, insane, refugee, or citizen. And I want to be really clear from the start. We are not talking about semantics here. This is not a grammar lesson.
Not at all. We are exploring a concept called the material force of categories. And the whole argument is that a category isn't just a neutral label, a word you use to describe someone.
Right.
It's a tool. It's a machine that physically shapes reality.
It sounds a little abstract,
Yeah.
to say a word has force. But when you get into this, it actually changes everything. It changes how history is written, and it challenges, the very definition of what's real, what we'd call ontology, and how we even know what's true epistemology.
Exactly. And that's our mission today. We need to unpack how this shift is really forcing the discipline of history to reinvent itself. We are moving from a history of events to a history of mechanisms.
Okay, so let's start with that first big word, ontology. Usually when I hear ontology, I think of, dusty philosophy books. But here, it sounds pretty gritty.
It is. Ontology is really just the study of what exists. And in traditional history, the thing that exists, the object of your study, is the event. And crucially, the event is dead.
Dead.
It's temporally complete. The Battle of Waterloo started, people fought, and then it ended. It's a closed chapter. So the historian is kind of like a coroner looking at a body. You're looking back at something that's already finished.
But this new approach says that's completely the wrong way to look at it.
Right. In this modern view, the object of history isn't the dead event. It's the category and the process. And here's the key difference. A category might have been created in the past, but it continues to function today.
So history stops being about what happened, and it starts becoming about what is still happening.
That's it. The historian isn't just explaining a fossil anymore. They're explaining a machine that is currently running. The ontological field of history suddenly expands right up to this very moment. We aren't studying the past as some foreign country. We're studying the architecture of our present.
I really want to drill down on this material force idea, because I think this is the hardest hurdle for people to get over. I look at a table, I see wood, nails, that's material. I look at the word student, and I just see a word, a social idea. How can a category have material force?
That is the central question. And let's use that exact example. The student. It's perfect because it seems so harmless, so mundane. In everyday language, we think student is just a description of something you do. You learn things, so we call you a student.
The neutral label. I'm a podcaster, you're a historian, they're a student.
But look at it through this new historiographical lens. The category of student is not a description. It's a physical constraint. As soon as you're categorized as a student, your body is subjected to very specific material realities.
Look what, for example?
Well, think about space. Being a student dictates which buildings you can enter and which ones are literally locked to you. You can't go into the faculty lounge. You might not be able to leave campus without permission. It dictates time. You have to be in this specific chair at 8 a.m.
That's true. It physically controls where my body is.
And it changes the legal reality around you. If you're a student, you're subject to a disciplinary code that doesn't apply to anyone else. If a regular citizen talks loudly in a library, maybe they get shushed. If a student does it, they could get detention or even suspended. The category is like a custom law book that just hovers over your head.
So when we say material force, we mean it literally moves people. It's not some metaphor.
It is not a metaphor. The category of the criminal moves a body from a home into a prison cell. The category of the insane moves a body from society to an asylum. The category of the pauper moves a body to the workhouse. These words are engines. They physically transport human beings.
That is a wild way to think about it. We usually think, okay, the person commits a crime, and the prison is just the reaction to that. But this suggests the category of criminality itself is a machine that was built specifically to process people.
Yes. And that's why that boundary between history and, say, sociology is just disappearing. If history is about these active categories like risk or citizenship, and those categories are still churning away today, then the past isn't a dead object. The historian becomes a technician explaining how the engine works right now.
Which leads us directly into the second big headache for traditional historians. If the what of history is changing, then the how has to change too. This is that epistemological shift.
This is where the academic fights get really intense. Epistemology is just how do we know what is true? And traditional history really relies on what you could call discovery epistemology.
The detective model.
Exactly. The idea is that the truth is just hiding in the archives. It's sitting there in a file cabinet somewhere. And if you read enough documents, if you dig deep enough, you'll discover the facts. You blow the dust off a file, and there's the truth.
But this new approach just takes a sledgehammer to that entire model.
It completely destroys it. Because if we accept that categories are manufactured tools, that they're not neutral descriptions but are actually tools of control, then the documents in the archive are the products of those very tools.
So a police report from 1920 about a, quote, juvenile delinquent isn't a neutral observation.
It can't be. The document itself is an act of categorization. We can't claim to discover the truth about that child in that file because the file was never written to describe the child. It was written to process the child through the legal system.
I love the metaphor that gets used here.
Yeah.
That we have to stop looking at the archive as a library and start seeing it as a crime scene.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It's incredibly evocative. But what does that mean exactly? Why a crime scene?
Because the archive is the specific site where the classification took place. It's where you could say, the violence of sorting happened. So a document isn't evidence of who a person really was. It's a trace of power. It shows how an institution decided to sort a human being.
So you're not reading the document to learn about the person. You're reading it to learn about the system that consumed the person.
Precisely. Take a medical record from the 19th century that labels a woman as hysterical. In the old model, a historian would write, in 1890, Mrs. Smith suffered from hysteria.
Treating it like a medical fact.
Right. But in this new model, the historian looks at that piece of paper and says, this document is proof that in 1890, a male doctor used the category of hysteria to strip Mrs. Smith of her agency and maybe even lock her away. The document is evidence of what was done to her, not who she was.
This has to change the whole definition of objectivity, doesn't it? In the old days, being objective meant standing back, being neutral, not taking any sides.
But you can't be neutral at a crime scene if you just repeat the categories. If you write, there were 500 insane people in this town, you're actually participating in the system. You are reinforcing the category.
You're validating the tool that was used to control them.
That's it. So objectivity now means something more like awareness. It means being hyper-aware of the harmful effects of the very categories you're studying. The historian has an ethical obligation to expose the category, not just report on it.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of this. We've talked philosophy, but how does this actually work on the ground? How does a category act? Because, as we said, words don't have hands.
They don't have hands, but they have bureaucracy. And that is the hand of the category. This is the idea of enactment. A category isn't something that just floats around in the air. It exists in the process of being applied.
It's the paperwork.
It's the forms, the risk scores, the medical protocols, the algorithms. When a doctor fills out a checklist to diagnose a patient or a judge looks at a sentencing grid, they are enacting the category. They're making it real in that very specific moment.
That's interesting because it implies the category is constantly being remade. It's not static. Every single time that form is filled out, the category gets a little stronger.
And it gets even more complex when we look at compounding effects. This is where we can see intersectionality, but through a mechanical lens. Categories almost never work in isolation.
Right, because you aren't just a citizen or just a student. You're a lot of things all at once.
Exactly. And when categories like race, class, and mental health start to overlap within institutions, like in a courtroom or a hospital, their effects don't just add up, they multiply, they compound.
Can you give us an example of how that compounding works mechanically?
Sure. Think about a modern risk score that's used in sentencing or policing. That score is a digital category, and it might pull in data from your zip code, which is often a proxy for class or racial segregation. It pulls in your arrest record.
And your arrest record could be influenced by how heavily your neighborhood is policed in the first place.
Exactly. So you have a geographic category stacking on a racial category, stacking on a legal category, and they all fuse together to create this new, heavier weight, the high-risk label, that just crushes down on an individual.
And then that label determines their whole future. Bail, parole, sentencing.
That is the material force. It moves you from freedom to incarceration. It's not a theory. It's a mechanism that physically relocates human beings based on how they're sorted.
However, and there's always a however in these deep dives, this all sounds very compelling, but it is also a huge departure from how we usually tell stories about the past. There must be pushback, right?
Oh, there's significant pushback. And it comes from very serious corners of the discipline. We have to be fair to the critics here, because they do raise some really valid points about the dangers of this approach.
Okay, so play devil's advocate. What is the biggest hole in this material force of categories theory?
The first big criticism is reification.
That's a $10 word. Let's unpack that.
Reification just means treating an abstract idea as if it's a real, living thing. So the critique is, are we giving categories too much credit? Do categories act, or do people act?
That's a fair point. A form doesn't arrest you. A police officer arrests you. A judge sentences you.
Exactly. Critics argue that by focusing so heavily on the force of categories, we risk turning these concepts into ghosts that are just haunting the machine. We might start to ignore the actual human decision makers, the economic interests, the specific politicians who wrote the laws in the first place.
It almost lets the people off the hook. It makes the system feel inevitable, like a force of nature, rather than a series of choices made by actual human beings.
Right, and connected to that is the fear of epistemic paralysis. Well, if we accept that every document is just a construction and every archive is just a crime scene of classification, how can we ever actually know anything true about the past?
It's a rabbit hole. If everything is a construction, then nothing is real.
It leads to a really deep skepticism. Some historians argue that if you take this idea too far, history becomes impossible to write. You can't say unemployment rose in 1930 because someone will pop up and say, but the category of unemployment was constructed by the state to manage labor.
Which is true, but also, people were still hungry. Unemployment did rise.
Exactly. You risk losing the reality of human suffering if you only focus on the label that was used to describe it. Hunger is a biological fact, regardless of the category used to track it.
And what about the people themselves? We've talked a lot about systems and machines. Where are the humans in all this?
That's the third major critique, the loss of agency. Social historians and microhistorians, they get very frustrated with this category approach. They say, if we only focus on how categories crush and move people, do we just erase all the stories of how people fought back?
Right. People aren't just passive inputs for a computer. They resist. They negotiate. They cheat the system.
Precisely. People survive these systems, they find loopholes, they redefine themselves. If we only look at the material force pressing down from above, we might completely miss the force pushing back from below. We risk painting a picture of total domination that just doesn't reflect the messy reality of human life.
And I imagine there's also the risk of looking at the past through our own modern glasses.
Anachronism, yes. It's very dangerous to assume that a category from the 19th century, like the pauper, is the exact same thing as a 21st century category, like the at-risk individual.
They sound similar, but the world was totally different.
The context, the economy, the culture, all of it is different. If we just draw a straight line and say this category is still at work today, we might be ignoring all the massive historical changes that happened in between. We might be flattening history into one long, unchanging nightmare of control.
So where does that leave us? We've got this powerful new tool-seeing categories as material forces, but we also have these really valid warnings about not losing the human element.
I think we're at a moment of synthesis. Despite the critiques, this approach has fundamentally changed the discipline. We can't really go back. We can't unsee the gears of the machine now.
History has transformed. It's not just a storytelling medium anymore.
No. It's become a critical diagnostic tool. That's probably the best way to describe it. History is now a way to expose the roots of the sorting mechanisms that govern our lives right now. It's about showing us the invisible architecture of our own society.
And that really is the so what for everyone listening. You don't have to be a historian to feel the weight of this stuff.
Not at all. We are all navigating these invisible lines every single day. Your credit score, your medical records, your citizenship status, your educational credentials, these are all categories, and they all have material force. They determine if you get the loan, if you get the job, if you can cross the border.
And understanding that these aren't just natural facts, but are actually built systems, is quite empowering. It means they can be understood and maybe even changed.
That is the hope. If they were made, they can be unmade. Or at least they can be remade.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've looked back at how these categories were built. What should we be looking for moving forward?
Here's the thought I'd want to leave you with. We often look back at the past and think, how could they categorize people like that? How could they be so rigid, so cruel? We judge the Victorians for their categories of the deserving poor or the lunatic.
We feel superior because our categories seem scientific now, or data-driven.
But we have to turn that gaze on ourselves. We have to ask, if categories are not natural but are built for specific purposes, which of the categories that we take for granted today, that we think are just objective or necessary, will future historians look back on as tools of control rather than descriptions of reality?
That is a terrifying and fascinating question. Which of our current truths are just future crime scenes in an archive?
Exactly. Is it the credit-worthy consumer, the radicalized individual? We're building the very boxes that future historians are going to have to dismantle.
That's it for this deep dive. It's definitely changed how I'm going to look at the next form I have to fill out.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Keep asking questions and keep looking for the invisible boxes. We'll see you next time.